It started with a joke, but within hours, that joke detonated into a full-blown political firestorm, one that exposed raw nerves, deep divisions, and a growing fear that the boundaries of speech, power, and retaliation are no longer clearly defined. Behind the polished veneer of a televised debate, something far more volatile was unfolding. Voices sharpened, accusations escalated, and what should have been a discussion turned into a confrontation charged with suspicion, anger, and something even more unsettling: intent. At the center of it all was a late-night remark, delivered casually, perhaps even predictably, but interpreted in wildly different ways depending on who was listening. To some, it was just another example of edgy humor pushing limits. To others, it crossed into dangerous territory, especially given the increasingly tense political climate. What followed was not just backlash. It was a chain reaction. Within political circles, frustration began to boil over. Sources close to the situation described a sense of unfinished business, not outrage that fades with the news cycle, but something more persistent, a perception that lines had been crossed repeatedly, without consequence, and now, perhaps, a willingness to respond more forcefully. That perception fueled speculation. Was this moment being seized as an opportunity? On the other side, critics wasted no time dismantling that narrative. They pointed to a long and well-documented history of inflammatory rhetoric coming from political figures themselves. Statements that had stirred controversy, spread widely online, and in some cases, blurred the line between provocation and incitement. The hypocrisy argument landed hard. How, they asked, can outrage be selective? How can one side demand accountability for words while dismissing its own record of explosive language? The debate didn't just intensify, it fractured. Participants spoke over one another, each trying to seize control of the narrative. At times, the discussion veered away from the original incident entirely, spiraling into a broader indictment of media, politics, and the growing influence of institutions behind the scenes. Because beneath the surface, another issue was emerging: power. Not just the power to speak, but the power to punish. As the conversation shifted, attention turned toward regulatory bodies and their potential role in the controversy. Questions were raised about whether government influence was being used, or could be used, to pressure private companies into taking action against individuals whose speech was deemed unacceptable. That possibility changed everything. This was no longer just a cultural clash over comedy or taste. It became a constitutional question, one that struck at the core of democratic principles. Where does free speech end and coercion begin? Some voices in the debate insisted that no lines had been crossed. They argued that criticism, even harsh criticism, is part of the system. That public figures, especially those in media, should be held accountable for what they say, and that companies have every right to decide who represents them. Others pushed back, warning that the situation was far more dangerous than it appeared, because when criticism is backed by power, real, institutional power, it stops being just speech. It becomes pressure, and pressure, they argued, can quickly turn into control. That tension created one of the most uncomfortable moments of the entire exchange. A direct question was posed: is it appropriate for those in positions of authority to influence the employment status of individuals in media simply because they disagree with their words? The response was anything but clear. Some attempted to reframe the issue, shifting focus to corporate policies, internal standards, and regulatory procedures. They insisted that any actions being considered were rooted in legitimate oversight, not personal vendettas, but skepticism lingered. Because context matters. And in this case, the context was impossible to ignore. This wasn't the first time tensions between political figures and media personalities had erupted into public conflict. Nor was it the first time accusations of bias, unfair treatment, or targeted pressure had surfaced. What made this moment different was the convergence of factors: heightened political polarization, a recent history of real-world violence, a media environment driven by outrage and amplification, and a public increasingly uncertain about where truth ends and narrative begins. All of it collided in that moment, and it showed. As the debate continued, the tone shifted from argumentative to almost accusatory. Participants began citing past incidents, not just to support their positions, but to expose what they saw as patterns of behavior, patterns of escalation, patterns of selective outrage. One side highlighted moments where controversial statements had been dismissed, defended, or even celebrated when they aligned with certain viewpoints. The other side responded with examples of consequences, individuals who had faced swift backlash, professional fallout, or public condemnation for remarks that crossed perceived lines. The comparison was stark and deeply uncomfortable because it suggested something many are reluctant to admit: that standards are not always applied evenly, that what is considered acceptable or unacceptable often depends on who is speaking and who is listening. As that realization settled in, the debate took on a darker tone. The discussion of rhetoric gave way to something more serious. The potential impact of words in a climate already strained by fear and division. References to past acts of violence surfaced, not as direct accusations, but as reminders of what can happen when tensions reach a boiling point. It was a subtle shift, but a powerful one, because it reframed the entire conversation. This was no longer just about offense, it was about risk, and risk in this context carries weight. Some argued that in such an environment, restraint is not just advisable, it is necessary. That public figures, regardless of their role, have a responsibility to recognize the potential consequences of their words. Others rejected that idea outright. They warned that placing such expectations on speech opens the door to censorship, that once you begin limiting expression based on potential interpretation, the boundaries become impossible to define and even harder to defend. That argument resonated with those who view free speech as an absolute principle, but it also raised difficult questions. Because absolute principles often collide with complex realities, and in this case, the reality is anything but simple. As the debate neared its peak, one theme became impossible to ignore: escalation. Each response seemed to push the conversation further. Each argument raised the stakes, and with every exchange, the possibility of resolution slipped further away. What remained was tension. Raw, unresolved, and growing. Off-camera, that tension didn't disappear. If anything, it intensified. Conversations continued behind the scenes. Statements were drafted. Positions were reinforced. And all the while, the story continued to evolve, fueled by speculation, interpretation, and a steady stream of new reactions. Public figures weighed in. Commentators dissected every word. Audiences picked sides. And through it all, one question persisted: where does this go next? Because if this moment proved anything, it's that the conflict is no longer contained to late-night television or political debate. Panels, it has expanded into institutions, into public discourse, into the very framework that governs how speech is understood, challenged, and potentially restricted. That expansion carries consequences, not immediate ones, perhaps, but significant ones. Because once the boundaries of acceptable speech become contested at this level, involving not just individuals, but systems, the outcome affects more than just those at the center of the controversy. It affects everyone, and that is what makes this moment different. Not the joke, not the outrage, but the implications, the sense that something larger is shifting, something that cannot be easily reversed. As the dust settles, at least for now, the lines remain blurred. No clear resolution, no definitive outcome, only competing narratives, each claiming legitimacy, and a growing awareness that the next chapter may be even more intense than the last, because this isn't just a clash of personalities, it's a collision of principles, and neither side appears willing to back down.